Good afternoon, dear colleagues and friends. Welcome back from the break. My name is Billy Batware. I'm a program officer at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. I'm really honored to be here with you this afternoon to moderate this panel, the first panel of this conference on international peace and security. I think we've heard quite a lot since the beginning of the panel already, partly on this very topic, and I'm very much looking forward to discuss with the distinguished panel members this afternoon. So I'd like to first thank the Diplomatic Academy for inviting me and all of us and for organizing this very important conference. As a Director General of the UNODC, the Director General of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and Executive Director of UNODC mentioned earlier today, conflict and violence are engulfing the world, with around a quarter of the global population living in conflict-affected areas, while simmering tensions threaten to explode elsewhere. A record 100 million people were forcibly displaced just last year. So the title of our panel today is very well reflected in the opening sentence of this particular conference description, which is as also reflected in the first word of the Charter of the United Nations. We, the people, are also at the heart of why the United Nations was created at the beginning. So the goal, as the conference describes, this conference is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And I will really challenge the audience today to say, I think that the topic we're discussing today is extremely important. I see this as a natural process of organization, such as United Nations, which was born, of course, to respond to peace and security, to be tested at every corner of the situation. And I think we are today tested more than we have been in a very long time. So, but just for myself, really, and for the audience, and also for the panel members, we want to make sure that we understand, when we talk about peace and security, that we also understand what that actually means. And for me, peace and security means access to health, to essential services, especially for women and girls, giving every young woman and man the chance to live as they choose, and developing sustainable and protecting the planet's future. So it's not just a mere fact of security, as we know from the context of Security Council. And in that context, security as well, and is defined by Samuel Makinda, is the preservation of the norms, rules, institutions, and the values of society. And he further argues in his definition that all the institutions, principles, and structures associated with society, including its people, are to be protected from military and non-military threats. So here, again, I think we are reminded about the first word in the UN Charter itself, we, the people. So going back to the people and the protection of people and their human rights. And so with that, I'm really excited once again to have this discussion with our panels. Our first speaker is Mr. Shashi Tharoor, who is a former UN Undersecretary General and current Member of Parliament in India. Sir, I'm very happy to share the panel with you. And I know that you like using quotes. And I do too, actually, quite a lot. And I would like to recall one of the quotes that you once used of the US President Franklin Roosevelt back then at the closing session of the 1945 UN conference, when he said, "You have created," telling the states, the member states at that time, "You have created a great instrument for peace and security and human progress in the world. The world must now use it. It will fail. If we fail to use it, we shall betray all those who have died in order that we might meet here in freedom and safety to create it." if we seek to use it selfishly, and I think there are many examples of that today, for the advantage of any one nation or any small group of nations, and again, we've heard that quite a lot today, we should be equally guilty of that betrayal. So I'm sure you are remembering this particular quote, and when you look around today, in today's world, the state of the United Nations today in this context, where multilateralism is tested like we have not seen in many decades. What keeps you awake in that regard? And how can we find consensus going back to find solutions within the UN compared to back in 1945? Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Billy. And let me just say that though I've been parked in this particular panel, I'm, as agreed with the organizers, taking a somewhat larger theme, which is the overall future of multilateralism. So I will be somewhat broader than Billy's introduction suggested, though we will, I'm sure, get into the specific details of peace and security as we go along, and I'm happy to participate in the discussion to follow. But I must start off by warning our chair and my friends in the UN today that I'm not planning to offer a terribly optimistic outlook. Despite having been someone who spent nearly 3 decades at the United Nations singing the virtues of globalization and multilateralism, I'm not so sure of its prospects today. Let's look at the world around us. We're living in an era where our societies are increasingly becoming fractured, where questions of identity and ideology seem to be driving us farther away from each other, and at a time where there seems to be a vacuum created by the absence of a collaborative brand of leadership worldwide. It started in some ways with a backlash against globalization that took 2 forms, economic and cultural. The economic backlash was straightforward. The poor and the unemployed in the developed world began to feel they had no stake in the globalized system and demanded to know why their governments' policies were benefiting people in faraway lands. Why were their jobs being shanghaied and sent off to China or India or whatever? And they wanted to, therefore, see something that would reduce the growing inequality in developed economies and go back to the security of older, more familiar economic ways in which each generation assumed that they'd live better than their parents did. The cultural backlash came from the same resentment but expressed itself in a different arena. The political denunciation of global trade also led to hostility towards foreigners as more and more people sought the comforts of traditional identity and ways of life. Rage was expressed against liberal politics, cosmopolitans and technocrats, trade agreements, immigration, multiculturalism. Animated often by middle-class and low-middle-class resentment of global elites, the masses rejected the entire brew of cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, and secularism in the name of cultural rootedness, religious or ethnic identity, and nationalist authenticity. Some saw the world as divided in David Goodhart's formulation between the somewheres and the anywheres. The anywheres being people in this room who are comfortable anywhere on the planet, flit from business class lounge to 5-star hotel, and join international gatherings like this one at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, whereas the somewheres are rooted in one place, immersed in one religion, one culture, speak one language, share one ethnicity. The sharpest riposte by the somewheres to any notion of world citizenship came from the former British Prime Minister, Theresa May, who tartly remarked, quote, "Anyone who considers themselves a citizen of the world hasn't understood the first thing of what citizenship is all about," unquote. Political leaders have been quick to seize the opportunity to tap into both kinds of backlash against globalization. Populist leaders like Donald Trump, who rose to the presidency of the US on slogans of America first and make America great again, and a host of others from Bolsonaro of Brazil and Erdogan in Turkey to Orban of Hungary and Narendra Modi of India, successfully persuaded their voters that they were far more authentic embodiments of their nations than the allegedly rootless secular cosmopolitans they sought to displace, and did. Their ascent inaugurated an era of nationalist strongmen embodied in the bare-chested photographs of President Putin. And I think in Europe you've seen quite a few variations of all of these, including in your own country here in Austria. And while some of them, Trump and Bolsonaro, for example, have at least temporarily exited their offices, together all these parties, including the ones in Germany, Austria, France, Denmark, and so on, Holland, they've all made nationalism the default model of national self-definition. Now, of course, these nationalists and strongmen have been challenged by liberal intellectuals who lamented their defiance of the recent consensus that the world was moving inevitably towards greater integration, where borders were becoming less relevant and sovereignty could be pooled for the benefit of humanity as a whole. But the emotional appeal of nationalism to most voters put the liberal cosmopolitans on the defensive. Now, these were trends that preceded the pandemic. They accelerated over the last 2.5 years, with borders becoming more rigid, communities further marginalized, and the notion of us versus them attaining primary importance. In some ways, COVID-19 inaugurated a new era of deglobalization, with the world embracing isolationism and protectionism more enthusiastically than prior to the outbreak. Because the COVID pandemic confirmed to many people that in times of crisis, people rely on their governments to shield them, that global supply chains are vulnerable to disruption and are therefore unsustainable, that dependence on foreign countries for essential goods, such as pharmaceuticals, or even the ingredients that go into making them, could be fatal. Many of you may remember the shock the US went through on discovering that 100% of their favorite headache remedy, ibuprofen, comes to them from China. And when the Chinese cut off supplies for 3 months at the beginning of 2020, there was this major sort of retail panic in the US. Nations tried aggressively to acquire medicines, supplies, and vaccines for their own people first, at the expense of each other. There was a rush to reset global supply chains and raise trade barriers. The demand arose for more protectionism and self-reliance, for bringing manufacturing and production value chains home, or at least closer to home. Now, these issues and trends have found fresh impetus following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which forced all countries to grapple with difficult questions, from the limitations on state sovereignty, the credibility of the UN Charter, which had just been violated by a permanent member, new disruptions of supply chains and trade, not only on commodities, all the way to issues like energy interdependence and the future of warfare itself. Now, while the consequences of Ukraine are still playing themselves out and COVID restrictions have seriously and significantly eased across the world, the pandemic and the resultant lockdowns reminded us that much of what seemed to be knitting the world ever closer together, and which we till recently took for granted, was vulnerable. The world economy that had thrived since globalization began in 1980 on a system of free trade is no longer thriving. That was already shaken by the financial crash of 2008-9, the American trade war with China. The pandemic then exacerbated the situation. Estimates suggest that nearly 1/3 of global trade fell in 2020. And though a gradual trajectory had started to emerge, then the war broke out, and the global economy has again been affected. Meanwhile, the pressure to decouple from China has increased in the pandemic years, even as sanctions on Russia have severely restricted trade, investment, and financial flows into and out of that country. And COVID-19 also convinced many that foreigners are to be feared, that strict border and immigration controls are essential, that countries can't always expect useful help from their neighbors and allies, and that national interests should trump international cooperation. Now the emphasis is much more on sovereignty, nationalism, self-protection, and resistance to foreign, quote, interference. The UN has every reason to worry about its continuing relevance, with its image further in decline in the eyes of the general public on account of its perceived inertia in preventing this war, or even mitigating the invasion of the sovereign borders of one of its own member states by a permanent member. I must admit that one of the questions that long-time watchers of the UN, and like myself, kept asking as the Ukraine crisis unfolded was what the UN Secretary General, the able Antonio Guterres, was doing. Because when the Americans and the Brits were screaming from the rooftops for about 7 weeks that there would be an invasion before it actually happened, couldn't the Secretary General have sought to use his good offices to resolve the crisis? Did he send an emissary to Moscow to find out their intentions and understand what their irreducible demands were? Did he have sent someone to Kiev to understand their fears? Did he even send someone to Brussels to talk to NATO? No one knows, but certainly the indications are not. I mean, these things don't have to be done publicly, but there is absolutely no shred of evidence that there was any shuttle diplomacy conducted. And what I'm curious about is that on previous examples, when there were threats of conflict, we've seen action. We've seen then Secretary General U Thant intervening between Moscow and Washington at the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. In those days, it was through telegrams rather than travel. Or Kofi Annan, back in '98, when the US was first about to bomb Iraq, he unilaterally undertook a trip to Baghdad, I was with him, to stave off the resort to war. But unlike them, Secretary General Guterres seems to have limited himself to earnest exhortations to observe a peace that Russia had already violated when he first spoke about it. Now, when the Secretary General has still obviously partially redeemed the image of his office, especially with the grain agreement that was already mentioned today, there's a general feeling that much more could have been done to prevent the course of events that has led us to where we are today. But it's simply not true that when a permanent member is belligerent, the UN is reduced to helplessness. The Secretary General can and should act. Somebody's already mentioned Article 99 today, and is not doing so became evidence of the weakness of multilateralism. Now, the fact is that there have been many obituaries written of the UN in the past. I remember vividly what happened when the US invaded Iraq in 2003. Similar things were said, and it's not surprising that 2 decades later, the same things are being said again, and perhaps we can afford some complacency. It wasn't true then, it won't be true now. Fine, but the fact is that, that there is a larger and more troubling point to be made here. As sovereignties are reasserted around the world, and treaties and trade agreements increasingly questioned, multilateralism is looking more and more like the first casualty. It was already in danger of being eroded before the COVID pandemic, Britain withdrawing from the European Union, America leaving the Paris Climate Agreement, President Trump pulling the US out of WHO, and isolationist voices already portraying themselves as vindicated. Now, some of those got reversed, but the WHO's organization, World Health Organization's response to COVID, with its indulgence of the official Chinese line, pointed to many to the waning legitimacy of international institutions, many of which seem to suffer from politicization, manipulation, lack of representation, and lack of independent leadership, independent, that is, of the powerful member states. Had global governance been working effectively, the world would have identified the coronavirus as soon as it emerged, sounded a global alarm earlier about its dangers, identified and publicized the best practices that should have been adopted by all countries to prevent or limit its spread, and none of this happened. And that it didn't happen is a pretty damning indictment of the state of our new world disorder. And this has regional implications. We're talking about, okay, multilateralism isn't working, minilaterals are rising. But the fact is that Europe was once seen as a poster child for the virtues of regional integration. But I have to remind you all here in Europe that the idea of Europe crumbled very quickly under the onslaught of the pandemic. The famous Schengen visa and the notion of border-free movement was the first casualty of COVID-19. We're forgetting this now. The EU countries threw up barriers at the first sign of the virus. Didn't take them long to rediscover the disadvantages and limits of the very free movement of goods and services and capital and people that they had sworn by for 5 decades. So geopolitically, this kind of global system rested in many ways on a series of geopolitical realities that don't exist anymore. The US is no longer the uncontested unipolar voice. The bipolar tensions are rising between the US and its principal competitor for the label of superpower, China. And I'm skipping a lot here because my chairman is getting restless on my right here. But I do want to say that the challenges rising from this are themselves a source of potential anxiety about the future of the global system, particularly given the fact that, again, it's too members, permanent members, that are facing off against each other. So COVID was far from being the first global bug to have bitten us, nor will it be the last. In 2001, we learned that anger and malice in the dusty caves of Afghanistan could take down skyscrapers in New York. The year 2008 saw the dormant financial malpractices in the US rapidly metastasizing into a global financial crisis. And in 2016, Russia tried to register itself on the voter rolls of the US elections, spawning a new global market for foreign influence operations. I think Amandeep Gill will tell us tomorrow about the great dangers that technology, its use and misuse, can pose for the global order as well. And now we've had war and destruction in Ukraine being added to this ominous mix. So let me just conclude by saying that it's clear that all of these tendencies cast some real serious doubts about the future of multilateralism, of the global system, of the United Nations' importance and relevance. And yet the sheer complexity and immeasurability of our interdependence cannot be denied. That requires more global governance, not less. And turning our backs on multilateral institutions at the first sign of weakness is unfortunate. I spent 29 years working at the United Nations, and I can say with confidence that the key lesson it taught me is that the world is a better place when the world is a better place when countries engage in dialogue, when they have a forum to talk through the problems they share, rather than writing obituaries for the UN whenever it fails to avert a conflict. Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General, famously said about the organization that the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. Sometimes that's the best the UN can do, and maybe that's the best that we can try and salvage out of all of this. And there's no question the future for the world lies in international solidarity. The rapid and global spread of the pandemic, the worldwide impact of the Ukraine war, are both devastating reminders in recent years of the consequences of disorder. And that's why the conference organizer should be commended on requiring us to think about reinvigorating the UN, because reasserting sovereignty should not imply an abandonment of global responsibilities. It'll be awful if all these trends that I've described to you result in destroying the most fundamental feature that the pandemic itself exposed, which is the fact, the reality, and the idea of our common humanity. We must not allow that to happen. We must learn to live and work together again. And that is what the UN has to be able to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Tharoor, for that incredible account of the sheer challenges that we face, but also I think you captured very well that despite all of that, I think there's need for a global governance that functions, and there's need to have that platform for dialogue, and I think that platform is the United Nations, as everyone has been emphasizing throughout today. So thank you so much. We get back to you for the discussion. So our next speaker, actually our next two speakers, is Ms. Katharina Pichler Coleman, who is with us online, and she's a professor of international relations at University of British Columbia, and she's joined by Eugene Chen, on my right, who is the Director of Crisis Prevention and Peacebuilding at the New York University Center of International Cooperation. So to both of you, I also just have a question. As you know, the world has evolved since the creation of the United Nations. I think we all agree on that. And so has peacekeeping as well. Today's conflicts have also evolved. And they are multidimensional. So how can the UN peacekeeping operations better adapt to today's complex realities and complex environments, and where for example, UN peacekeepers face threats from armed groups, spoilers, international transnational criminal networks, political unrests, and where they also, the UN peacekeepers, have to implement ambitious mandates that include the protection of civilians in human rights and state building. Chen, if you would like to start, and maybe Kathy will start. Okay, Kathy will start online.
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation to join the conference. It's really an honor to participate, and I wish I could be there in person. Grateful for the opportunity to join via Zoom. Unfortunately, my co-author, Eugene Chen, is able to be in Vienna. Mr. Batware, you're right to point to these challenges of evolving and multidimensional mandates. And we suggest that there's really a need to reimagine and reposition peacekeeping operations to better address these. Having been invited to speak to the question of reinvigorating UN peacekeeping, I think it makes sense to start by considering what it needs to be reinvigorated from. So this graph, in a way, gives you one illustration because it shows just how much UN peacekeeping has contracted in recent years. So since its 2015 peak, active missions have decreased from 16 to 12. Authorized expenditures are down by almost over 26%. Uniformed personnel deployments down by about 30.5%. Civilian staff posts have been shrinking for longer and are down by about 57% since 2011. There hasn't been a new UN peacekeeping operation since 2014. Underlying these trends is in part a pervasive crisis of confidence in UN peacekeeping, despite really a wave of academic writing showing some of its benefits, notably in reducing armed violence and protecting civilians. And that crisis of confidence exists both at UN headquarters in New York and in the field where the peace operations are being employed. At headquarters, there's long been tensions among states over UN peacekeeping. Among the P5, that's contestation about both the liberal dimensions of peacekeeping and Western leadership of it that predates Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but certainly has not been improved by it. Though it's worth noting that mandates so far have continued to be renewed. But also long and sharp disagreements amongst mostly Western states who are the major financial contributors to UN peacekeeping, and China, and troop contributing countries, on the other hand, over both funding and funding cuts, but more generally also divisions of labor and authority. What's sorely missing at the moment is a coalition of states, a strong coalition of states willing and able to champion UN peacekeeping. And instead there's frustration over large and often long-running and dangerous missions that seem unable to address underlying conflicts in host states. Could we go back to the previous slide? I'm not quite done speaking to that one yet, if possible. Thanks. Crisis at headquarters also extends to the Secretariat, where many officials share concerns about the impact and utility of large multidimensional peacekeeping operations. But officials are also demoralized by states' continuing demands for funding cuts and withdrawals, including when benchmarks indicate that violence and fragility is still very much persisting. And there's worries about commitment to peacekeeping operations at the top, while bureaucratic battles between the departments of peace operation and political and peace-building affairs preoccupy officials and sometimes stymie reform efforts. Critically, though, there's also a crisis of confidence in the field that exists among local populations who are often disillusioned with major missions and frustrated and increasingly hostile to missions, as protests in the DRC illustrate. It exists among civilian staff in peace operations who are frustrated by a persistent pressure to do more with less as tasks multiply and resources diminish, and demoralized by mission results, by hostile environments, apparent lack of support from headquarters, and relentless downsizing cycles. And finally, there's a crisis with other members of the UN family, the agencies, funds, and programs that also often exist in the field, may approach implementation of overlapping tasks differently, but find themselves out sometimes sidelined by much larger missions and fear that robust missions are limiting the humanitarian space. What the next graph shows us, though, or reminds us of, if we can switch to it, is that UN peacekeeping has faced contractions before and is capable of rebounding very, very quickly, not least because alternatives are limited. And it's worth noting that peacekeeping remains also a very cheap conflict management option compared with other options. We argue that, if we can skip to the next slide, reinvigorating UN peacekeeping requires, first of all, reimagining it in the field. We propose a networked approach to mandate implementation that allows missions to, on the one hand, concentrate on political and security tasks and relies on greater partnership with UN agencies, funds and programs for peace-building tasks. We think that this approach can help produce a better integration of missions into broader conflict management efforts and peace-building efforts over time. That by institutionalizing partnerships with agencies, funds and programs, we can also generate greater effectiveness in the field, help address local legitimacy issues, and provide ways of mobility and better staff management, which then also creates a basis for renewed headquarters coalition in support of UN peacekeeping. Doing all this, though, requires rethinking management, mandate implementation and support structures, which is what Eugene will address right now.
Thank you so much, Katja. So despite the fact that it has been widely acknowledged that the proliferation of mandated tasks and peacekeeping missions are a problem, the Secretariat has not been successful in reversing this trend in its proposals to the Security Council. And the Security Council itself has continued to authorize missions with very comprehensive mandates, which is what colloquially is referred to as the Christmas tree mandate problem in New York. In response to these Christmas tree mandates, in the design and deployment of peacekeeping operations, organizational units are created in peacekeeping missions for each mandated task. And this proliferation of mandated tasks leads to lack of focus and prioritization in missions, and a resulting lack of a clear sense of common purpose among staff, which also affects morale in those missions. This is part of the templated approach that the Secretariat uses in the design of peacekeeping operations. And as Katja noted earlier, when peacekeeping missions are deployed, they're often this overwhelming presence that absolutely dwarfs the agency's funds and programs of the UN country team. Missions oftentimes act as if they are the only game in town, even when the country team is present, has been present since before the mission, and will continue to be present after the mission has departed, and also has built up expertise and relationship with local and national counterparts that missions may not have. This, unsurprisingly, leads to frictions in the field that oftentimes exacerbate existing rivalries at headquarters. Moreover, the focus of missions is to continue implementing mandated tasks until Security Council terminates those mandates. And it's as if those mission staff are treating history as if it ends with the conclusion of the mandate. This, however, is increasingly a problem. As Katja pointed out, peacekeeping is in decline, and right now all multidimensional peacekeeping missions are either in active drawdown or have been asked by the Security Council to already plan the transitions. Last year, the Secretary General sent a report to the Security Council on transitions which identified several recurrent issues with previous UN transitions, which include the failure to recognize early enough that transition planning is integrated planning with the country team and should be done throughout the life cycle of the mission. And second of all, there's a recurrent lack of attention by the mission to post-mandate considerations, such as the need to maintain progress in peace building and sustaining peace, as well as ensuring a responsible departure. It's also important to recognize that the Security Council increasingly ends mandates for political reasons other than progress in achieving sustainable peace in those individual countries. Although missions should be designed with all these considerations in mind from the start, transitions do provide an opportunity for a limited degree of reconfiguration as missions draw down, and we argue that the templated structure of multidimensional missions is one of the key drivers of the demoralization amongst staff and tensions within the country team. These two very complicated looking charts illustrate the current templated approach, which is on the left-hand side, and a proposed potential optimized structure for peacekeeping missions on the right. But basically what this slide illustrates is two shifts that could be considered in mission structures that could help address the aforementioned challenges. The first is to build on the now common practice of missions to engage the agency's funds and programs as implementing partners for some individual projects under programmatic activities, but to go much beyond, to actually delegate the full responsibility for specific mandated tasks to country teams who have the expertise and the comparative advantage over those tasks. The second shift would be to reposition some of the supporting architecture within missions that deal with planning, monitoring, and analysis, as well as administration and logistics, as not just mission resources, but actually resources that can really underpin the programmatic delivery of the entire system, kind of that fundamental foundation for joint programming. It's also important to note that this type of matrix approach to mission management could also be used to increase coherence between peacekeeping missions and country teams with regional organizations such as the African Union, which is oftentimes also operating under Security Council mandates in the same countries as peacekeeping operations. Member states are generally not receptive to changes in intergovernmental processes. And so the shifts that we are proposing don't actually require changes in practice of the Council or the General Assembly in budgeting. All of this also kind of facilitates shifts in how missions are run. Actually, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just because we are running a little bit out of time here. But basically, ultimately, in terms of financing and support here. So on the support side, I already mentioned how one of the things that we are proposing is to move a lot of the capacities that really support missions to be kind of system-wide capabilities. So human resources, procurement, and logistics processes can actually allow missions and the UN to better take into account sustainability and impact on local capacities and economies. For example, local staff engagement can be designed to better provide a pipeline of personnel into national civil services and local institutions. Facilities and infrastructure planning can be built with handover to the country team or local communities in mind from the very start. And when missions are planning for the generation of fundamental capacities such as electricity, just to power camps, for example, that can allow them to shift away from the traditional approaches of rely on diesel and to leverage the mission's financial resources and the longer-term UN demand to be able to invest, for example, in renewable energy infrastructure that can benefit populations for years after missions exit. And I will actually now turn back to Katja.
Just to very briefly then think about both the feasibility and the benefits of this, and we argue that it's both. The feasibility comes in part because this sort of networked approach doesn't actually require member states to change some fundamental practices. Christmas tree mandates and multidimensional peacekeeping are here to stay in many ways, and for reasons that we can discuss further, but in part for good reasons. The UN budgeting process remains in place. The approach is also feasible because it builds on precedents that are already established. So the notion of the primacy of politics and greater cooperation between missions and country teams already exists in the HIPPO report, the High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations. There's already guidelines for funding for programmatic activities using assessed contributions. So in a way, this approach builds on building blocks that already exist in the system. What it brings is the benefit then of thinking about missions, as Eugene was saying, in the context that goes beyond the end of the mission itself and thinks of it in the long time horizon of mandate implementation through various steps in conflict management. It has the potential to achieve greater effectiveness because it has greater coherence within the UN system. It can address some of the disquiet amongst staff by helping to promote mobility within the UN system. And all of these things can also provide, we think, a basis for a renewed coalition of support at UN headquarters. And on the one hand, allowing missions to focus on the peacekeeping and political tasks, to reinvigorate peacekeeping as such, and to take some of the peace building tasks into funds and agencies that have specialization in it. And in the interest of time, I'll stop there, and both of us are happy to answer questions during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Katja and Chen as well. I think they also deserve a round of applause. Thanks so much for proposing also many different solutions to how we can improve peacekeeping operations within the UN, including, I think, putting in place or ensuring that there's early warning systems also to ensure that the readiness of the peacekeeping operations, including, of course, providing robust mandate and funding and proper support from the ground. So thanks so much for that. Our next speaker is very well known to everyone. Mr. Markus Kornprobst is our host, of course, and he's a professor of international relations here at the Diplomatic Academy. Markus, I also have a question for you. I know that, of course, diplomacy is at the heart of the work of the United Nations, as we all know. And in the halls of the Security Council, the GA, everywhere where multilateralism is taking place. So hence, I believe also that we can speak of diplomatic peace, right? And in the context of the work of the UN. So perhaps building on what Mr. Tharoor has also mentioned in terms of multilateralism, how does diplomatic peace look like in practice? And how is it being used or can be used to make the UN function better?
So what I want to talk to you is diplomatic peace. What could that be? And it's in a way a very, very simple thing that I've done. So it's really not rocket science at all. I asked a very simple question. As a social scientist, one is used to always defining things and then superimposing that on the social actors, political actors one studies. And I refrain from doing so. So I simply asked the question, when we look at how diplomats define peace, how do they actually define it? Yeah? In a social science sense, not an international law sense. And I want to get at agreements on what peace is. So I don't want to say just have something or whatever, an EU understanding or something like that of peace, but really a global one. And in order to do so, then it's quite obvious one can look at the United Nations because near universal membership. And then one thing one can do is look at the UN Charter, and there peace is mentioned 47 times, 32 times, by the way, in the frame of this formula, international peace and security, and the rest just peace. And it is used in different ways. And then there's another interesting provision in the Charter, that is the General Assembly elaborates on the general principles of cooperation and peace. And this is what I looked at then. So I looked at General Assembly declarations and conventions, and more precisely those that the General Assembly itself identifies as key resolutions, so key declarations and conventions, and then simply looked at the word peace and the kind of meaning in which it is used. And then I detected 218 documents altogether, which were passed without a vote cast against them. That was important for me because then I have an understanding of a consensual understanding. Yeah. So there are 20 resolutions dropped out. Most of them, by the way, had to do with human rights, social rights, economic rights. There was the one cluster, and the other one was disarmament. And then overall, I was left with 1,887 occurrences of this word peace or related ones, Pacific, peacekeeping, and so on and so forth. And then I clustered that according to three big categories. The one is restraints, the second one is compromise, and the third is dialogue. Restraint means that I am really angry with you, and I am fully prepared to lash out, but I don't. I restrain myself. The second one is compromise. So it's an understanding that we have to meet somewhere in the middle. You have to concede something, and I'm going to concede something in return. And dialogue means that things actually open up much more in terms of communication. In principle, I'm prepared to somehow at least revisit my own positions. And to give you a first glance of this, so just to highlight how this has evolved over time, then there's not that many mentionings of peace early on, although a couple of really important ones. Yeah, so Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's mentioning of peace. Anti-Genocide Convention, there's mentioning of peace. But then in terms of quantitatively, things really pick up in the 1960s and early 1970s. And then interestingly enough, afterwards it goes down a little bit. Then we have from 1985 to 99, it actually goes up quite a bit. Then it goes down again. The early zeros, according to that graph, were not all that great. So really quite a little bit below from what we had before. And then afterwards, slowly but surely, it picks up again. If we look now, and I need you again. And if we look at these three categories, restraints, compromise, and dialogue, then I looked at the kinds of restraints that is dominant in these documents. And one of them is really not dominant at all, it's really out. So that I restrain someone, I restrain a state by deterring the state, by threatening to use force. So there are lots and lots of provisions against that, probably most powerfully in the 1974 definition of aggression. There is a lot on cooperative restraint. Yeah? So in the words of Joe Clark, former Canadian foreign minister who talked about cooperative security, it really has moved from mere collective security to cooperative security. There's more and more on intrastate affairs, more and more on restraint in internal affairs and internal conflicts. It has something to do with the evolution of peacekeeping, something to do with the evolution of peace building. And then in the World Summit outcome, we have famously the principle of the responsibility to protect. We are furthermore more and more branching out, so not just in terms of this classical understanding of the use of force, but also in terms of international crime, in terms of international terrorism, and so on. And then there are also some hints at what one could call a categorical restraint, so that under no circumstances you can use a certain kind of force, and even then to take away the means to engage in violence. So we are at arms control and at disarmament. There's one interesting finding, actually, to some extent, my conclusions are going to be there's more and more of this peace, more and more of these principles of peace. When it comes to strong formulations about categorical restraint, actually, we're moving backwards. Yeah? During the Cold War, actually, there were strong statements. So forever banish wars from the life of human society, complete disarmament and strict and international control. And then from the 2000s onwards, much, much weaker formulations. And those formulations are usually about arms control and not about disarmament. Next one is on compromise. Again, there is one kind of compromise is out. So if I gain a lot from a compromise, I make very few concessions and you make a lot, then that kind of lopsided compromise, literature refers to it also as rotten compromise or foul compromises, is out. There is in these UN documents, in these General Assembly documents, there is a lot of emphasis on principled compromises. Principled compromise mean, okay, we really meet now in the middle as sovereign equals. And these compromises are structured in two ways. Number one, there is oftentimes mentioning of a purpose that is higher than the national interest. Shashi actually talked about this beforehand. I mean, not in that context, but he actually talked about it in terms of alluding to humanity. Yeah. So, for instance, common interest of the global society, common interest of mankind, universal peace and larger freedom. So those are all things, and not national interests, but it goes way beyond that, this global interests. And then there are more and more principles that are supposed to guide these compromises. So there's not just any kind of meeting in the middle, but there's a lot of guidance about these principles. And probably the strongest one that in my research I found was in the World Summit outcome. And then we have, for instance, quote, the right to self-determination of peoples which remained under colonial domination, foreign occupation, non-interference in the internal affairs of states, respect for human rights and fundamental freedom, respect for the equal rights of all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and the fulfillment in good faith of the obligations assumed in accordance with the Charter. Yeah? And obviously there are many, many more of those principles. There are not that many hints in these documents about kind of institutionalizing this give and take, reiterated compromises. I can extrapolate from that. So I can say, okay, if someone writes about a reinvigorated multilateralism or global governance for the common future, then this basically presupposes something like a system of compromising, but it's an extrapolation on my part. And then probably the most important, for me, the most important or striking finding was about dialogues. Because dialogue probably of this triad is the most difficult one. Yeah? So I am in principle prepared to revisit my own understandings in light of the communication with someone else. And there we have actually from the very beginning, then there's not necessarily the talk about dialogue is a different kind of language, but definitely about mutual understanding. And then going further, then there's oftentimes a postulate about building community through communication. Yeah, spirit of understanding, tolerance, friendship among peoples, peace and universal brotherhood. So to move again up to something an understanding of humanity, and parallel to that, of course, also in the frame of peace building, to look at the national level, reconciliation, bring people together in domestic politics. And then we have from the 1990s onwards, we have very far-reaching promises of deliberation. And so, for instance, Declaration and Program of Action on the Culture of Peace, 1999, that one was consensual. Other attempts later on were no longer. Conflicts are solved in a spirit of mutual understanding and cooperation. Then, starting in the 2000s, a lot on civilizational dialogues. And when we look at later documents, so say digital technology, advent of it, and again, immediately then the attempt to think about opportunities in terms of dialogue. So new digital technologies as an opportunity to foster dialogue. If we look now very briefly, because I don't have much time for it, and I'm actually writing a whole book on those promises kept and broken in the Horn of Africa. But just very, very briefly, if we look at these promises kept and broken, and yes, they are promises, and we can discuss then to what extent what of this is legally binding and what it's not. Yeah, a lot of what I rely on is the declarations, actually. But if we look very, very quickly at it, then promises in terms of restraint, well, I mean, overall, if we look development since the end of the Second World War, of course, then we have way fewer occurrences of interstate wars compared to before. But we have persistence of interstate wars, so we see that with Russia and Ukraine, and there were obviously several cases before that already in other parts of the world. We have problems with arms control regimes. We have very little success in terms of disarmament. And of course, we have the persisting problems of internal wars. Yeah, we all know internal wars since the end of the Second World War have been much, much more destructive than interstate ones. In terms of compromise, it's probably a good thing that there are all of those principles for compromise. If we look at compromises reached, then they reach into basically any kind of policy area one can think of, yeah? So including environment, migration, health, and so on. It's just that there are persistent violations of these principles for compromise. And when I look at something like understandings of humanity and going beyond the national interest, something higher than that, then probably at the moment we really are in trouble, because we do experience a resurgence of nationalism and of nationalist and geopolitical thinking on security issues. And with dialogue, there definitely have also been successes in terms of dialogue. There's no question about that. But I think overall, dialogue is one of the most abused words in the diplomatic language. So usually, if negotiations don't go on, then there's something about, okay, so we need to have a dialogue or something like that. But it's not necessarily meant in a sincere way. It's not necessarily meant in a sincere way, okay, I'm actually now talking to you and I'm trying to break deadlock and I'm trying to step into your shoes. Now, from that, and I've talked now probably too long, very, very briefly. From that, in terms of reinvigorating the United Nations, there basically are two clusters of conclusions. One of them we really ought to watch out for as civil society, as diplomats, member states, as members of the Secretariat, really ought to watch out for those promises that member states have made already, and those promises on restraint, compromise, and dialogue. Do states actually keep them or not? When do they break them? What can we do against that? And then, of course, also to build upon what we have already. Number one, to look at concrete situations and what kind of restraint, compromise, dialogue is actually fitting for that kind of situation. And also to watch out the implementation record. And this implementation record, I think, in the international environment, in regional environments, in domestic, and also in local environments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Markus. I think everyone is interested to read your book. When is it coming out? I think that's probably the question in everyone's mind.
The book is probably something like 5 years from now. But there's an article in the Hague Journal of Diplomacy that's basically that presentation.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Markus, for that. Our last speaker, certainly not the least speaker, is Ms. Chiara Giorgetti, who is a professor of international law at University of Richmond. You have quite a task to come after these incredible speakers. But I'm very excited about your topic because it's going to be talking about whether we are in a new era of peace and security. So are we really in a new era, Chiara, of peace and security? Should this be a renaissance or maybe this tight Vendée that we talked about this morning for the United Nations? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And as a last speaker, I decided actually to stand up so you can see me better. But as a last speaker, I also have the benefit of having heard what has come before me and the previous speakers, and I would like to build on some of what was said and maybe give some more details. But first of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me in this beautiful place and in this beautiful town. So is it a new era of peace and security, and how will we know if we are in a new era of peace and security? So as we've discussed, as we've seen already talked earlier today, after World War II, and with the devastation brought by it and the failure of the League of Nations fresh in their minds, the winner countries that negotiated the UN Charter in San Francisco created a new international organization that had a very specific division of power. On one side, you had a very powerful Security Council, whose two-tier membership included up to the 5 most powerful states, and now 10 others that were elected on a rotating basis. The Security Council has the ability, under Chapter 7 of the Charter, to issue binding resolution. On the other side, you have the General Assembly, that would include every member of the organization with an equal vote, but this resolution will have no binding force. And the Security Council would have the primary responsibility within the United Nations system for the maintenance of international peace and security, as well as the enforcement of international law. Of course, there are other primary organs of the United Nations, but let me focus on these ones today. Soon, however, the dysfunctionality of the system began to show, and as we discussed already, the power dynamics also of the Cold War began to show, and the Security Council became gridlock. Vetoes of the permanent members precluded the intervention to halt atrocities and generally prevented the Security Council to carry out its mandate to ensure peace and security. And just few numbers. During the Cold War period, the Soviet Union vetoed 122 resolutions, the US vetoed 80, Britain vetoed 32, France 20, and actually China vetoed none. The frequent use of the veto showed that, especially in cases where the United Nations could halt humanitarian disasters, also eroded the legitimacy of the United Nations Security Council. and called for a new thinking and a resolution of new thinking about what to do to ensure peace and security. Of course, at the end of the Cold War, the Security Council also in the early 90s lived for a short period of time, showed what an effective Security Council could be, with the creation, for example, of several tribunals, the ICTY, the CTR, Claims Commission, the UNCC, and heightened peacekeeping operations, although we've seen now that this is not the case anymore. And in fact, all of this was short-lived. The Security Council inability to deal with the most important crisis facing the world was soon refaced, and we have some examples now and previously, of course, the example of Syria, Palestine, and now Ukraine. And over the years, as we heard from the ambassador earlier today, numerous proposals to amend the UN Charter were also made, but none were so far have been agreed upon. And in parallel, also throughout the years, there's also been a call for a stronger role of the General Assembly, a more democratic and not an institution that's not undermined by the veto struggle. So what I would like to do for the remaining of my time, looking at what the General Assembly has done, and I would like to focus on specifically what the General Assembly has done in the context of Ukraine, but also give some more general conclusions, also provide some general conclusions. And I will look specifically then at several issues. One, the Uniting for Peace resolution that we've talked about, but I provide a little more details. The creation or support of new bodies that the General Assembly created as deemed necessary for the performance of its functions, ex Article 22 of the Charter. The use of advisory opinion, the request for advisory opinions to the International Court of Justice, and also another General Assembly resolution that was already mentioned, the meeting trigger resolution when the veto is used. So for the first part, the Uniting for Peace resolution. This is actually quite interesting, a very powerful mechanism that was created. The Uniting for Peace resolution was created to enable the General Assembly to act quickly in an international crisis in the face of the Security Council paralysis due a permanent member vote. The resolution was actually adopted firstly in 1950, as proposed by the United States and in response to the Soviet Union's veto over resolutions addressing North Korea's aggression against South Korea. The United for Peace resolution allows the General Assembly to immediately consider matters in which the Security Council has failed in its duty to maintain international peace and security due to the use of the veto. And it can do so when asked either by a majority of the members of the Security Council, and this is a procedural issue, is not subject to the veto, therefore, and upon its own decision to make up the matter with a 2/3 vote of the Assembly itself. If the Assembly is not in session, the Uniting for Peace process allows it to convene in an emergency session. And what does it say? So what does this resolution 377 says? I have to put my glasses on. Resolves that if the Security Council, because of the lack of unanimity of the permanent members, fails to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, in any case where there appears to be a threat to peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression, the General Assembly shall consider the matter immediately with a view to making appropriate recommendation to members for collective measures, including, this is quite important, including in the case of a breach of the peace and act of aggression, the use of armed force when necessary to maintain and restore international peace and security. As I mentioned, in its initial use of this authority in 1951, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 498, calling upon states to support continued UN military action in Korea. And it was also used in 1956, and I think also another speaker mentioned this before, when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, prompting Britain, France, and Israel to attack Egypt with the objective to regain Western control. And again, the United for Peace resolution was used there. And since its first use, that resolution has been invoked only 11 times, 7 times at the request of the majority of the members of the Security Council, and 4 times unilaterally by the General Assembly. But when it was used in actually a very strong, a very interesting way. So recommended, for example, the application of sanctions on Israel, or the withdrawal from occupied territories, the establishing a commission of inquiry, and many other very interesting way. Until the 2022 Ukrainian crisis, however, the Security Council had not referred any matter under this resolution since 1982, and the General Assembly had not unilaterally invoked it since 1997. So what happened now with the Ukrainian crisis? And in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the US called for the use of the Uniting for Peace resolution, and it did so in what I think is quite an effective way. So on February 27, 11 members of the Security Council voted in favor of this resolution calling for an emergency session of the General Assembly. And Russia opposed, and 3 members abstained, so China, India, and the UAE. The special sessions resulted in the adoption of Resolution ES 11.1 by a very large majority, 141 in favor, 5 against, and 35 abstentions. And the resolution, although it didn't maybe used all of the powers that could possibly be used in the Uniting for Peace, under Uniting for Peace resolutions, this is something that was very important because the General Assembly looked at the issue of aggression and recognized the crime of aggression very specifically, and in the language of the resolution, deplored in the strongest term the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of Article 2.4 of the Charter, and condemned Russia's declaration as to the necessity of this special military operation, and demanded Russia to cease its use of force against Ukraine, as well as to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. It also condemned all violations of international humanitarian law and violation and abuses of human rights, demanding that parties to the conflict fully comply with their obligation under international humanitarian law to spare the civilian population. And this is quite interesting. It actually already had a concrete use by the International Court of Justice when it found that Russia committed aggression in Ukraine. The International Court of Justice ordered provisional measures in application also of Resolution 11.1, ES 11.1. And the resolution was also followed by a further resolution. We said 4, but I would like to specifically look at another one that was approved on November 14th, 2022. The resolution L6 2022 entitled Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation for Aggression Against Ukraine. And I think this is quite interesting and is also quite unique. This was co-sponsored by 56 member states and gathered a significant positive vote with 94 votes in favor and 13 against. And what did this resolution do? Also quite innovatively, created a framework for accountability when there's a Security Council that is deadlocked. And what did it do specifically? It created a link between the definitions of aggression and the idea that there's been a violation of international law and the responsibility to provide reparation, full reparation under international law, which is very important. Of course, the resolution is quite long. But it calls for, it provides a link specifically to the articles also on state responsibilities, the responsibility of states to provide reparation. And I quote here saying that Russia must bear the legal consequences of all its international wrongful acts, including making reparation for the injury, including any damage and causes caused by such acts. And this link is actually very important because now we have a definition of aggression, the finding that an aggression existed, and the consequences of this aggression, this violation of international law, and these consequences include full reparation for damages. The resolution itself does not create a new body for reparation, but urges member states to create one. and to create an international mechanism for reparation for damages, loss or injury and arising from the international wrongful acts of the Russian Federation in or against Ukraine. And here it follows somehow the example of other claims commissions. One is the United Nations Compensation Commission, which however, of course, was created by a Security Council resolution, and the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission, which also differently was created by an international treaty. So here we have a different scenario. In the scenario that the United Nations General Assembly followed is actually more similar to the United Nations Registry for Damages that were created by 0 minutes. Oh, wow. Sorry. I'll be very quick then to conclude. The Registry of Damages that was created by the United Nations General Assembly in application of the advisory opinion of the construction of the wall in the occupied Palestinian territory to record loss and damages. And here I would like then to take two, can I have one more minute? Yeah, thank you. So here are two more issues. One is in this resolution, then we reconnect to the creation of a registry for damages. And the General Assembly has actually been quite resourceful and very interested in creating new commissions and new bodies that almost have a judicial function. It was already mentioned, the international impartial and independent mechanism for Syria was also mentioned, and this is one. And the second is the registry for damages in the United Nations, also as a consequence of an advisory opinion, an application of an advisory opinion. And then the second thing, then the use of advisory opinions in twice for Palestine, one for the construction of the wall, but also the consequences. For Chagos also, the use of advisory opinion, and possibly the forthcoming one also on the consequences of climate change. And then to conclude, Chair, and thank you. So I mentioned three issues: the United Peace, the issue of advisory opinions, and the possibility of creating new bodies. And the fourth one, which is going to be brief because it has been already mentioned, the new resolution in 76-262, which was proposed by Liechtenstein, as we've heard, which require the United General Assembly to decide to automatically meet within 10 days if the veto is used in the Security Council by one of its 5 members. And in sum, to conclude, maybe it's not a complete new world of peace and security, but certainly, so not a revolution, but certainly interesting steps to see how the General Assembly can be seen as taking a bigger and more important role to ensure peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Chiara, for that. Also, I think you stressed and then you confirmed also what some panel members earlier mentioned, which is maybe it's really not to come up with new instruments. It's just to look outside the box and make use of the existing instruments in different ways, be innovative and look outside the box. So thank you so much for that. We do not have much time, so I had prepared a few other questions for the panels, but in the interest of time, I will open up to the audience also to have the opportunity to interact with the panel members. So we will take a few questions. We have about 15 minutes for that. We have mics at the back and somewhere in the rooms. We have one question over there at the end, one question here in the middle. We will take those two first, and then one question on the other side. So we'll take those 3 questions first.
My name is Anna Kolesnichenko. I'm Associate Fellow at GlobeSec. It's an international affairs think tank. My question is about this diplomatic peace. And I'm not particularly an expert on United Nations, but I did study some democracy questions in general. And it seems to me that whenever parties or states come to discussions, they always come with their interests, and then there's always bargaining. And but then, if you want actually, how to say, dialogue, as Markus was like doing this classification, then I think you should involve not country representatives who come with interest, but somehow civil society, broader circles, and so that people can go beyond interests and agendas and find common ground, basically. And so in this context, I would say maybe United Nations need to strengthen this supranational, or I don't know, component, so that it's not just United Nations, maybe even change the name, but United People. So when you have maybe a second chamber, or I'm sure that there are probably already many consultative bodies, but maybe give it more power, like so that it's not only nations who talk, but also people who talk, and then you will be able to reach better decisions.
Thank you very much. This is a question over there, please, and then we go there, please.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is George Pudubali. I am a former UN official. I want to thank the panel members for all your very valuable information. I have a question directly to Dr. Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor, you started off in a rather pessimistic tone to say you will not have much positives to talk about the future of bilateralism. But nonetheless, I recall that you were just one vote away from becoming the Secretary General of the UN some 14 years ago. And I'm sure you had a vision about how to ensure multilateralism works better. In the current world, of course, you elaborated on what the Secretary General could have done and alluded to some of them. But beyond that, it would be interesting to hear your perspectives on your vision and how you would have elaborated in the current world from the perspective of member states, but also from the perspective of the peoples of the world as the UN has been built on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll take the third one and then we collect the answers.
Hi, my name is George Poller. I'm a student here at the Diplomatic Academy. Firstly, thank you very much for the very interesting panel. Secondly, my question would be to Professor Kornprobst. In your data, in your research about the mentions of the word peace, did you also do a spread on the types of states that were mainly mentioning peace over the years, as to larger states, smaller states, regional differences, and so on?
Thank you so much. Did we have a fourth question? Then we can... Okay, we have several. Maybe we take these three quickly, and then, or should we take? Let's. I think I noted the question, and we can ask the panels to respond. So let me see. We had Michael Platzer here in front, and the ambassador again of Sudan in the middle. So maybe the ambassador, since you're already there, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have two questions. The first one is to Dr. Tharoor regarding the role of preventive diplomacy and conflict prevention. I think that is very important. And remember, the former Minister of Defense of the United States says that it is far more cheaper to invest in peace than to invest in conflict. So how can we, how can we empower the UN in conflict prevention and preventive diplomacy, taking into consideration the fact that sometimes even the Secretary General will be not in a position to wrangle with a permanent member. We have the experience of Kofi Annan when he was having differences with one of his members of the Security Council. The price was he lost a second term as the Secretary General. So how can we empower the UN in conflict prevention, in preventive diplomacy and conflict prevention? My second question to Mr. Katharina and Eugene regarding the peacekeeping, reinvigorating the peacekeeping missions. We find that, especially in interstate conflict, especially in our case in Africa, we have that conflicts are interrelated to development. And that when we come to the Security Council for financing peacekeeping, you will find that the Security Council is sometimes generous in authorizing peacekeeping missions. But when the conflict is over or the mandate of the peacekeeping is end, we will have the problem of how to finance post-conflict management, post-conflict reconstruction, and peace building. And so, how, for instance, in our case in Darfur, the Security Council, the last at one time was providing more than 2 billion for the UN peacekeeping mission. So when we have peace, after the peace agreement, when we have, what we call special political mission, they were given only $46 million US. So to engage in post-conflict reconstruction and peace building. So how can we rectify this in order to enable, to have a sustainable peace? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The last question, Michael Plaza, please.
Hi. I'm sorry, it's another question for Shashi. He was so provocative. You criticized the U.S., rightly so. But when I was at the UN and you were at the UN, there were many distinguished Indians, generals, undersecretariats, chief of staff, Secretary General's office. What happened there? I mean, what has happened with Indian peacekeeping in the missions, and what's the attitude in India about the UN? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have 6 questions, and we have about 2 or 3 for Mr. Tharoor. So maybe we start with you. And as you respond to the questions, maybe also give, sort of, any concluding remarks that you may have?
Yeah, I think one go at this is probably all we have time for. Broadly on the question of how one can revitalize the United Nations in the face of the realities that I sketched in my remarks, I would say that there is no sort of simple, glib answer. It's an ongoing process. But I can certainly stress that given in particular the intractability of the role of the Secretaries General in terms of the Permanent Five, the question that you alluded to, there is a need for the Secretary General to use the powers already given to him, including Article 99 of the Charter, which has been mentioned here, and the extraordinary moral influence of his office, especially in today's era where the Secretary Generalship is a very visible position. Kofi Annan got a good laugh out of being dubbed the secular Pope of the world, but in many ways that is what the Secretary General is. And the Secretary General therefore has an enormous capacity to go beyond and articulate issues beyond the national interests of the member states, including the permanent members. Yes, Ambassador, you're right that there are limits on the ability of the Secretary General to push permanent members, especially when he's locked in conflict with them, though you're not accurate about Kofi not getting a second term. He got a second term. It was during his second term that he had this problem over having declared the Iraq war to be illegal, which he was really badgered into doing. I was present when it happened, and he had said twice that the war was not in conformity with the Charter, which was a much safer formula. But the journalists kept saying, you mean it's illegal? It means it's illegal. And Kofi had a long day, he was tired, and he said, yes, it's illegal, and that was that. Until then, he'd had a pretty decent relationship with the US, even when, for example, he made that trip to Baghdad, which essentially ended up delaying US bombing plans, as it were, for some time, because Saddam then made some of the concessions on the weapons inspections, which would have, which forestalled bombing at that time. But Kofi also said something that you will enjoy as the ambassador of Sudan. He said to me once that his father had taught him a Ghanaian proverb: never hit a man on the head when you have your fingers between his teeth. And you think about that for a second. And that is, the Secretary General permanently has his fingers between the teeth of powerful and influential member states. And if he hits them on the head, they could get bitten off. But that doesn't necessarily mean the Secretary General is powerless. It means he has to choose and pick. That, you don't want to antagonize the US, say, on one issue because you need the US's cooperation on 10 other issues. And the sum total of your engagement with the US on all those issues may actually be a net positive for the UN and for world peace. So the answer to the first question, and partially to yours too, is that it's got to be an ongoing work, an ongoing process. Nothing is done, you can't come in on day one saying, I'm going to be an activist Secretary General and be an activist Secretary General. You will have to be responding to the events as they occur. And you will sometimes have to change your approach and change the nature of the relationship. On Michael's question of India's attitude to the UN, India remains, broadly speaking, strongly committed to the UN. When I last checked, India was still the second largest donor to the UN Democracy Fund, for example. It was and remains, I think, the largest contributor historically to UN peacekeeping operations, though I may be a little out of date. I'm not following the UN in as much detail as I used to. There are, of course, prickly sensitivities on the part of a state like India. It's always multilateralism is a great thing for the world, but not in my backyard. And that is something which has led a country like India to clamor for a greater voice in some of the key decisions that may affect it. And I do believe that Security Council reform is objectively necessary, because when there isn't representation, there will inevitably be a disrespect for decisions taken by a body that is not deemed to be fully representative. Never forget, for example, that the Libya sanctions were fraying when finally the US and the Brits worked out a compromise with the Libyans and a deal was struck. But if it hadn't been struck, the sanctions would have collapsed. We had even no less a figure than Nelson Mandela flying to Libya and essentially violating UN sanctions declared by the Security Council. He could say, and others would say in Africa, no one asked us. We have no permanent member of the Security Council to express our point of view before you sanction the head of our Organization of African Unity. So all of these things, I think, has to be borne in mind. The world is an evolving place. Member states have concerns which also evolve in significant ways. And as far as the Secretary General is concerned, he has tremendous room for maneuver precisely because there are member states at loggerheads. He therefore has the ability to he or she one day will have the ability to navigate between these irreconcilable opposites. I'm not prepared to give up on the UN, but I will agree with a couple of the propositions we've heard throughout the day. One is that the UN is a reflection of us, of us all, of the member states we have. It's a mirror of the world. It reflects our inequalities. It reflects our disagreements. It reflects all the challenges that we have, and it also reflects the power balances amongst the big persons. We speak of the equality, the sovereign equality of member states, but when 15 countries are sitting around the Security Council table, have no illusions. There are 14 countries extremely aware, or 13 countries nowadays, extremely aware of their relations with the two very hefty powers on that table. And those relations go outside that room as well. So how they behave in that room could affect their relations with those countries in bilateral issues that matter to them. So multilateralism must be seen with an awareness of bilateral imperatives. And at the same time, I believe that there is a tremendous potential for a creative, imaginative, flexible, articulate Secretary General to use the moral and indefinable power of his office, in addition to the formal powers granted by the Charter, to go out and actually try and make a tangible difference in revitalizing the organization. We will not be able to have, I'm sorry to say, some of the suggestions we've heard today, automatic sanctions against a permanent member will never happen, because the whole logic of permanent membership was the right to prevent anything being done against the interests of a permanent member. Won't happen. Same with General Assembly resolutions for the same reason. The General Assembly's resolutions are not self-executing. Somebody has to be able to, even Security Council resolutions need to be executed with the political will of member states. So if the permanent members are resolutely opposed to something, it will not happen. Or it'll happen in violation of the Charter, as the US showed in 2003 and the Russians showed in 2022. But let's not be completely hemmed in by that. Let's find ways of rising above it, and that's really why we need a strong Secretary General and not a quiescent one.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir. Those would be great concluding words, but I would like to ask Markus, also the other panelists, at least to respond to the final questions. And Markus, as you respond to the question about the analysis that you have done, maybe reflect to one question online as well, which refers to the Pretoria Peace Agreement, and whether this diplomatic peace can play a role in the African region.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Let me take the questions the other way around. Yeah, the beauty of the findings, in my opinion, are that all states have agreed to that. Yeah, so all of them. So it's not a matter of small states or global south, so they've all agreed to that. Yeah, there's really promises that are made by all of them, and I find it interesting because one can despair and one can say, okay, so the world really is a terrible place, sometimes more, sometimes less. Yeah. But these promises, these guidelines, and some of these are binding international law. Yeah, they're very much there. So the research is really meant to remind people that this is actually there, and it is consensual. Yeah? I even kicked out from my analysis, if there was one vote cast against something, then I kicked it out. Yeah? There's 20, by the way, that I kicked out because votes were cast against them was predominantly by NATO states or by the global north. And then your point about looking more at united people than United Nations, that's very well taken. Yeah? And the interesting thing there too is if we look at certain documents, if we look at the Millennium Declaration, if we look at World Summit outcome and everything, then there are a lot of these elements in there that you talked about. Yeah, so they're already written in documents. So the multi-stakeholder, all stakeholders. So especially when it comes to this dialogical element, there is actually a lot already in documents that one has to broaden up the communication. Then it cannot just be about the member states or perhaps the great powers. Yeah? And I think. I mean, what people like us can do is try to remind people at the United Nations and member states that this is actually already in the books, so to say, and it's really, really important to take that seriously. Yeah? And it's in the books for international disputes, and it's very much in the books for domestic disputes. Yeah. So the peacebuilding concept has really moved more and more actually towards looking also at the local and including local people, and then building peace from below. Yeah, as completely imperfect as all of this is still when it comes to implementation. Yeah. And Pretoria Peace Agreement, that is probably about the Ethiopian issue now, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's difficult for me to tell. So one of my doctoral students who runs around with a microphone, he's working on Ethiopia. Yeah? It's difficult for me to tell because I have to speculate there. Yeah. So I am to some extent hopeful that it's going to hold. Yeah, because so the conflict has been very costly for the Tigrayans, also for the Ethiopian government. So judging from that, there's oftentimes this concept in political science of a hurting military stalemate. Perhaps that was there. There was, of course, a lot of external pressure on the parties to come together. But I think it's probably still a little early to tell. And we do know that especially in the Horn of Africa, there have been lots and lots and lots of peace agreements made, and lots of them broken in all kinds of different countries. So I do hope that it's going to hold, but I certainly can't say so with any certainty.
Thank you, Markus. Chen and Katya, could you just respond quickly to the question from the ambassador with regards to sustaining peacekeeping?
Yep, I'll do this very quickly since we're a little over time already. The approach to networked peacekeeping that we're proposing is actually intended to address the very question that the ambassador raised about how the financial resources for peacebuilding dry up after a mission's exit. This is a problem we call the peacebuilding cliff. So in fact, the approach that we're proposing does this in two ways. The first is that by kind of bringing in the missions and country teams as part of a comprehensive strategy, it really allows the missions to focus on the political engagement and creating the protective environment while leaving kind of the dealing with the drivers of the economic and institutional drivers of violence to the country team. Now, the second part of what we're proposing does is it ensures that the capacities and the expertise and institutional memory for the peacebuilding tasks remain with the country team, the agencies, funds, and programs, rather than disappearing when the mission leaves. Now, this also allows the major donors to the agencies, funds, and programs to have much more visibility over the actual peacebuilding requirements in terms of dollar terms early enough for them to be able to plan to ensure the sustainability of that financing after a peacekeeping mission leaves. Now, sometimes gaps will always exist, and this is actually one of the reasons why the Secretary General has actually recently recommended that the General Assembly provide a cash infusion of 100 million in assessed contributions to the Peacebuilding Fund to also help address the impact of some of these peacebuilding cliffs in the future because of all the transitions that are coming up in peacekeeping operations. I could say very much more, but I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chiara. Any final words you would like to reflect on?
Thank you very much. Maybe why don't I try and get, try to respond to that question about people access, because I find actually the evolution and the access the individual and people have in international law, in the international legal system, something that is quite fascinating and has really evolved quite substantially since World War II. And I think it's one of the biggest evolution that we've seen. So we've seen, and here I think we have some examples. For example, if you look at the International Criminal Court, shows that individuals have obligations and you have direct ability to prosecute individuals. The individuals, of course, have human rights, but how do you access this? How do you provide those rights? How do you provide more access? I think there are several ways. In fact, there's a lot of access to individuals in negotiations already. I've seen in the ones that I've participated to, NGOs and individuals have quite, I think, a lot of access. But of course the restraining is, and I think you mentioned and this panel already was mentioned, is the idea that international is something that applies internationally between nations. So what is the individual's roles? I think one of the questions that we have to think about is really that link of nationality and citizenship. And is this something, and this is what the restraining factor is. We acquire a role because we are nationals of a country, and how can that maybe be changed and maybe reframed to give more access. And in general, if I can just 30 seconds also, just to respond to the role, I agree with you that the role of the Secretary General is obviously a very strong one. But if you think about the Charter of the United Nations, we also want to look at other principal organs, and this is why I thought that it's quite interesting to think at the role of the General Assembly at the International Court of Justice, but specifically looking at the provisions of the Charter on the General Assembly. And sorry, I've abused your allowing me to use the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chiara. No, thank you all panel members. I really can only just quickly sum up and what we have just discussed, which is, I think, a confirmation of what we have been hearing already since the beginning of this conference. From one angle, even though there's a pessimistic view of where we are with regards to multilateralism, I think there's still hope and the belief in the United Nations system, that it is a system that remains the only best platform and for dialogue for multilateralism. And there are new ideas or existing ideas that can actually contribute to peace and security, including how can we better finance peacekeeping missions and better and encourage and ensure a better preparedness for that, such as through early warning systems, and also through the existing instruments that I think we already have. There's a way to reinvigorate the United Nations in many different ways. And I would say, looking maybe at not just the Security Council as one body, because that's where the main issues are, but also look at the other part of the United Nations. You mentioned the Secretariat, of course, which is one, but also look at the UN agencies like UNODC, like different other UN agencies, UNHCR, that are doing incredible work on the ground, and look at those as well to create a better picture and a comprehensive picture of where the UN is and where the UN is going. And I think finally, it's very important also to look at the fourth UN, which is the civil society of the United Nations, which are these non-governmental organizations that are doing incredible work in support of the mission of the United Nations on the ground, many times actually in the absence of the UN, in the absence of the presence of member states. They're doing incredible work. We've seen this especially during COVID-19. So I think we can say also in terms of the future of the UN that empowering young people is important, and there are many young people here in the room. And creating more space for civil society is going to be critical. And I think also in a view of the next year's Summit of the Future, we will see whether that question will be answered as well. How much of other voices can we bring in those dialogues at the UN to make sure that we can diversify the voices and push member states to think differently. So with that, really, I thank the panel members, and I thank all of you who are here in the room, but also those of you who are joining us online for this incredible session. We apologize for the delay, but we hope that you have a nice evening. I think, Markus, you have something to announce about the dinner reception. But before that, really, I would like to acknowledge the panel members and to all of you.